Welcome back to Blackout Archives. Before we get into these stories, make sure to subscribe. Now, let's get started. This story comes from my time working at Target back in 2019, and I've debated sharing it for years. Looking back, I should have heeded the warnings from former employees, but when you're desperate for work and the pay is decent, you tend to ignore the red flags. I guess the store's color scheme should have been warning enough. I had just moved to a small town in rural Michigan, about an hour outside of Detroit. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and the local Target serves as one of the few modern connecting points to the outside world. The store had been there since the early 90s, one of the older locations in the state, and it showed its age despite numerous renovations over the years. I remember my first interview with the store manager, Sarah. She seemed hesitant when I specifically requested the overnight stocking position. There was this moment where she paused, looking down at my application, before asking if I was sure I wouldn't prefer a daytime position. When I insisted that overnight worked better for my schedule, she got this strange look in her eyes. "Well," she said, "we do need the help. Just make sure you always work with at least one other person." Store policy. At the time, I thought it was about safety from burglars or something. I wish it had been that simple. The store itself was larger than most Target locations I'd been to, with an especially massive backroom that seemed to stretch on forever. The receiving dock was old style, with these heavy metal doors that made the most awful screech when opened, and a long, dimly lit corridor that led to the main storage area. The sales floor was standard Target layout. Electronics in the back corner, clothing taking up the center, and grocery occupying the far right side. But something about the store felt off, even during the day. The ceiling seemed higher than it should be, the aisles somehow longer, and the red walls more intense than the typical Target color scheme. My team consisted of 4 people: me, our night manager Dave, a guy in his 50s who'd been with the company for over 20 years, and 2 other stockers, Mike and Jessica. Dave was the kind of manager who'd been around long enough to have seen it all. Or so I thought. Mike was a college student working nights to pay for school, and Jessica was a single mom who preferred the night shift for the better pay and quiet atmosphere. The first few weeks were normal enough. We'd come in at 10 p.m., just as the store was closing. Dave would distribute our assignments for the night, usually several pallets each of merchandise that needed to be stocked before morning. The store took on a different character at night. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, creating pools of harsh light that made the shadows seem darker than they should be. The usual Target soundtrack of pop music was replaced by an eerie silence, broken only by the sound of our work and the occasional beeping of the electronic inventory systems. It was during my 4th week when things started getting strange. I was working in electronics one night, stocking a new shipment of video games, when I heard music playing from one of the display TVs. This wouldn't have been weird, except all the display models were supposed to be turned off, and when I went to check, every screen was dark, but I could still hear the music faintly coming from somewhere in the department. When I told Dave about it, he just shrugged and said the electronics sometimes act up at night. Power surges, he explained, but he wouldn't meet my eyes when he said it. A few nights later, Jessica quit without notice. She didn't call, didn't show up, just vanished. When I asked Dave about it, he muttered something about how it happens and quickly changed the subject. Mike told me later that she'd been acting strange her last few shifts, constantly looking over her shoulder and refusing to work in the back room alone. I didn't think much of it at the time. Retail jobs have high turnover, after all. Then the incidents with the merchandise started. At first, it was small things. Items we'd just stocked would somehow end up back in the middle of the aisle, or products would be found in completely wrong departments. We blamed it on confused closing shift workers or customers who changed their minds at the last minute. But then it started happening with heavy items, furniture, large electronics, things that couldn't have been moved without a team lift or a pallet jack. One night, I was working in the furniture department, assembling a display chair. I had all the pieces laid out in front of me, and I turned around to grab the instructions I'd dropped. When I turned back, the pieces were arranged in a perfect circle, with the screws forming an arrow pointing toward the back room. I told myself it had to be Mike messing with me, but when I radioed him, he was all the way in grocery, and Dave was at the front of the store. The back room became a source of constant unease. During the day, it was just a storage area, but at night, it seemed to take on a life of its own. The motion sensor lights would trigger when no one was there. We'd hear the sound of pallets being moved, boxes falling, or wheels rolling on concrete. But when we checked, everything would be exactly as we left it. Dave implemented a buddy system for backroom work after Mike swore he saw someone duck behind a shelf, only to find the aisle was a dead end when he checked. The security cameras should have caught any unusual activity, but they had a habit of developing mysterious blind spots or static during the night shift. The loss prevention team would check them in the morning and find nothing wrong, but we all knew better. Sometimes, reviewing the footage from certain cameras would just show hours of black screen, even though the equipment was functioning perfectly during the day. One particular night stands out in my memory. I was working in the seasonal department, setting up Halloween merchandise, ironic, considering what was happening. The store had just gotten in a shipment of those motion-activated decorations, the ones that spring to life when someone walks past. I was putting them on the shelves, making sure they were all turned off, when suddenly every single one of them activated at once. Dozens of cackling witches, howling wolves, and screaming ghosts all going off simultaneously in the dark store. I nearly had a heart attack. But what really got to me wasn't the decorations themselves. It was what I saw in the reflection of the mirrored ceiling tiles that ran along the main aisle. For just a split second, as I was trying to shut off all the decorations, I caught a glimpse of something standing behind me. It was tall, much taller than any person should be, and it seemed to be wearing a red vest, like our uniform. But its proportions were all wrong, and where its face should have been, I turned around so fast I knocked over a display, but nothing was there. When I told Dave about it later, he got really quiet and said maybe I should take my break early. The final straw for me during those first few weeks came when I was doing inventory in the back room. I was counting boxes of home goods, making my way down one of the long aisles of steel shelving units that reached almost to the ceiling. The motion lights were acting up again, creating this strobe-like effect that made the shadows dance. I heard what sounded like someone walking at the other end of the aisle, their footsteps echoing off the concrete floor. "Mike," I called out, but there was no answer. I knew Dave was in his office doing paperwork, and Mike was supposed to be working in electronics. The footsteps stopped. Then, from much closer than they should have been possible, I heard someone whisper my name. The voice was all wrong. It sounded like multiple people speaking at once, but slightly out of sync. I turned around slowly, my heart pounding, but the aisle was empty. That's when I noticed all the boxes on the shelves had been turned around, their labels facing the wall, even though I'd just been counting them moments before. I ran out of that aisle so fast I nearly collided with Mike, who was coming to find me for our lunch break. When I told him what happened, he got this look on his face. Not surprise, but recognition. That's when he told me about the other night stalkers who'd quit over the years, about the rumors of what happened in the store after hours, about why Target could never seem to keep overnight staff for more than a few months at this location. But I didn't quit. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was the fact that I really needed the job, or maybe it was because part of me needed to know what was really going on in that store after dark. Looking back, I wish I'd walked away right then, because what happened in the following weeks made these first incidents seem like nothing. The worst was yet to come, and it would start with the mannequins in the clothing department. But that's another part of the story, and just writing about these early experiences has brought back memories I've tried hard to forget. I'll share more soon, but I need some time to collect my thoughts. Some wounds, even years old, still feel fresh when you reopen them. All I'll say for now is that if you're ever in rural Michigan and see a Target hiring for overnight stock positions, keep driving. Some jobs aren't worth any amount of pay, and some stores should be left alone after dark. I didn't want to continue the story, but after sharing the first part, I've received several messages from other Target employees who've experienced similar things. One message in particular caught my attention, from someone claiming to be a former employee at my store who simply wrote, "Did you ever find out what happened to Jessica? I still haven't, and that's part of what haunts me about all of this." After those first few weeks of strange occurrences, things escalated in ways I still struggle to explain. It began in the clothing department, which had always been creepy at night. The store had these full-body mannequins, the kind with detailed faces and articulated joints. During the day, they displayed the latest fashion trends. At night, they became something else entirely. I first noticed something was wrong when I was doing price changes in women's clothing. Target requires these changes to be done overnight, so the new prices are ready for opening. I was working my way through a rack of dresses when I got that feeling. You know, the one where you're certain someone's watching you. I looked up, and one of the mannequins on the elevated platform was facing my direction. This wouldn't have been strange, except I distinctly remembered it facing the main aisle when I started working. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I'd just forgotten its original position. But then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Its hand was raised slightly, fingers extended, as if reaching for something. I knew this pose was impossible, because Target mannequins came with fixed poses. Their joints could move, but they required tools and time to adjust. The next night, I mentioned it to Mike while we were unloading a truck. He got quiet, then told me he'd been avoiding the clothing department altogether. "Haven't you noticed?" he asked. "Every morning, they're arranged differently than how we left them." He pulled out his phone and showed me pictures he'd been taking at the start and end of each shift. The differences were subtle. A turned head here, a shifted arm there, but undeniable. Dave caught us looking at the photos and confiscated Mike's phone, citing company policy about taking pictures in the store. But I saw his face when he looked at those images. He knew something. That same night, I overheard him arguing with someone on the phone in his office. "It's happening again. No, I can't just ignore it this time. They have a right to know what they're dealing with." My curiosity got the better of me. One night, while Dave was busy with a vendor delivery, I snuck into his office. The filing cabinet in the corner had always been locked, but the key was in his desk. He'd gotten careless lately, distracted by whatever was happening in the store. Inside, I found employee records dating back to the store's opening in 1992. What caught my eye was a manila envelope marked incidents. Night shift. The records painted a disturbing picture. Every few years, there would be a cluster of overnight employee resignations, usually preceded by reports of unusual activity in the store. The reports were vague, but certain details kept repeating. Items moving on their own, strange sounds from the walls, and most frequently, problems with the mannequins. One report from 1994 described a night stalker who barricaded himself in the break room, claiming a mannequin had followed him from clothing to grocery, physically followed him, walking on its own. But it was what I found at the bottom of the envelope that really shook me. A newspaper clipping from 1991, before the store was built. The headline read, "Former asylum land to be developed." The article detailed how Target had purchased the property where the Oakwood Psychiatric Hospital had stood from 1924 until its demolition in 1987. The hospital had been shut down after multiple patient deaths under mysterious circumstances, and locals had opposed the development, claiming the land was tainted. I was so engrossed in reading that I didn't hear Dave return. When he found me with the records, I expected him to fire me on the spot. Instead, he sank into his chair and looked older than I'd ever seen him. "Now you know," he said. "It's not just in your head." He explained that every store manager before him had kept similar records, passing them down along with verbal warnings about what to expect. Corporate knew but did nothing. As long as the store remained profitable, they treated the incidents as mere curiosities. That's when Dave told me about Jessica. She hadn't just quit. She'd left a note in her locker about a mannequin that kept appearing in places it shouldn't be. The same one over and over, with a slightly different pose each time. The last straw was finding it in the break room one night, seated at her usual table. She ran out mid-shift and never came back. After learning all this, I became obsessed with watching the mannequins. I started taking my own photos, documenting their positions. That's when I noticed her. Among all the blank-face figures, there was one that stood out. A female mannequin with a slight imperfection, a small chip in its left cheek. At first, I only noticed it in women's clothing, but then it started appearing in men's, then children's, then home goods. Always with that same damaged cheek, always oriented slightly toward wherever I was working. Mike quit the next week. He didn't give notice like Jessica. Just walked out in the middle of his shift after claiming he saw the mannequin with the chipped cheek standing in the back room, in an area where we never stored display fixtures. Dave tried to convince him to stay, but I heard Mike screaming as he left. This place is wrong. Everything about it is wrong. The store itself seemed to change after that. The aisles felt longer, the ceilings higher. Sometimes I'd turn a corner expecting to find electronics and end up in seasonal instead. The floor plan I'd memorized in my first week became unreliable. Distances seemed to shift. A walk that should have taken 30 seconds would take 5 minutes, while other times I'd reach destinations faster than should have been possible. One night, working alone in market, Dave had stopped enforcing the buddy system, as we barely had enough staff to cover the basics. I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. The mannequin with the chipped cheek was standing at the end of the aisle. Not just standing, but standing differently than any display pose I'd ever seen. Its head was tilted at an impossible angle, arms hanging loosely at its sides, fingers splayed in a way that reminded me more of rigor mortis than any fashion pose. I blinked, and it was gone. But when I returned to clothing an hour later, I found it back on its display platform, perfectly posed, except it was wearing a different outfit than before. An outfit identical to what I had been wearing that night. The security cameras should have caught all of this, but they were becoming increasingly unreliable. Footage would show the mannequins in one position, then cut to static for a fraction of a second, and show them in completely different poses. The night shift maintenance worker who handled our cameras quit after reviewing footage that showed a mannequin turning its head to face the camera, while 2 aisles away, someone could be seen arranging the same mannequin in a different position. Target assigned specific stockers to specific departments, and after Mike left, I was given clothing. No one else would take it. The first night alone there, I noticed the lights were different. The fluorescent tubes seemed to flicker more, creating strobe-like effects that made the shadows dance. The mannequins appeared to twitch in the stuttering light, their joints moving ever so slightly with each flicker. The chip-faced mannequin became my constant companion, though I never saw it move. It would just appear, always closer than the last time I'd seen it, always oriented toward me. Sometimes I'd find it holding items I'd just been working with, or wearing pieces of clothing I'd just finished folding. Once, I found it holding a price gun, the same one I'd set down moments before when I went to get new security tags. Dave started spending more time in his office, leaving me alone on the sales floor for hours at a time. The store felt emptier each night, the silence more oppressive. Even the usual nighttime sounds of the building, the hum of freezers, the tick of heating vents, seemed muted, as if something was absorbing them. The only constant sound was the soft shuffle of hangers when I worked in clothing, though sometimes I'd hear it even when I was nowhere near that department. As I write this, I realize how impossible it all sounds. But the photos exist, or existed, until the night my phone disappeared from my locker, only to reappear a week later with its memory completely wiped. Dave had warned me about taking pictures, said it only makes things worse. They notice when you notice them, he'd said, and I'm still not sure if he meant the mannequins or something else entirely. The breaking point came when I arrived for my shift one night and found the chip-faced mannequin in the break room, seated exactly where Jessica used to sit. It was wearing a red vest and name tag, Jessica's name tag, which she'd left behind when she fled. As I stood there, staring, I swear I saw its fingers twitch, just slightly, like someone just waking up. I ran to Dave's office, but he was gone. His desk was cleared out, his office dark. When I called the store manager the next day, she told me Dave had transferred to another location, effective immediately. She asked if I'd be interested in the night manager position. I declined. The thing is, I don't think it was just the mannequins. I think they were just the most visible part of whatever was wrong with that store. The shifting aisles, the strange sounds, the way time seemed to flow differently after dark. It was all connected to something bigger, something that had been there long before Target built their store on that cursed ground. But what happened in the back room on my final night, that's the part I'm still trying to make sense of. The part that makes me wake up screaming some nights. The part that makes me avoid retail stores after sunset. The part I'll share next, though writing it down means admitting to myself that it really happened. For now, I'll just say this. If you're shopping at Target and see a mannequin with a small chip in its left cheek, leave immediately. Don't look back, don't take pictures, just leave. And if you ever find yourself working the night shift there, pay attention to the mannequins. They're paying attention to you. It's taken me months to work up the courage to write about my final night at Target. Some experiences change you forever, leaving scars that never truly heal. What happened that night falls into that category. Even now, years later, I can't walk into any retail store's backroom without having a panic attack. The smell of cardboard and the sound of pallet jacks are enough to trigger flashbacks. After Dave's sudden transfer, I was the only original night shift employee left. Target had hired 2 new stockers, but they never lasted more than a few shifts. The store brought in temps, but they'd invariably quit before their first week was done. Most didn't even bother calling. They'd just disappear, leaving their vests and name tags in the break room, usually draped over that damn mannequin with the chipped cheek. My final night began like any other. I arrived at 9:45 p.m. for the 10 p.m. shift, changed into my red vest, and waited in the break room for the others. The temp agency had sent 3 workers, but only one showed up, a guy named Chris who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The closing team left quickly, barely acknowledging us as they hurried out. They knew better than to stay after dark. The acting night manager, a corporate transfer named Lisa, handed out our assignments. Chris got grocery. I got clothing and seasonal. Lisa said she'd handle electronics and would be doing inventory counts in the back room. Standard night or so, it seemed. The first few hours were quiet. Too quiet, really. The usual ambient sounds of the store were muted, as if something was absorbing them. I worked through my tasks methodically, trying to ignore the mannequins, but they were active at night. Every time I turned around, they'd shifted slightly. The one with the chipped cheek kept appearing throughout the store, always just at the edge of my vision. Around 2 a.m., Chris quit. I heard him yelling from grocery, something about seeing someone walking between the aisles, someone who disappeared when he got close. He practically ran out of the store. I didn't blame him. I would have done the same if I'd had anywhere else to go. That's when the power started failing. First the lights went out in seasonal, then in clothing. The emergency lights kicked in, casting everything in a dim, reddish glow. Lisa called over the radio, saying she was checking the breakers in the back room. I acknowledged, but got no response. That was the last time I heard her voice. I tried to continue working, but the darkness kept spreading. Section by section, the main lights failed until only the emergency lighting remained. The store took on a hellish appearance. all those red walls reflecting the emergency lights, creating endless shadows that seemed to move on their own. Then I saw what looked like Lisa walking quickly past the end of my aisle, heading toward the back room. I called out, but she didn't respond. Something about her movement seemed off, too fluid, too smooth. I followed, telling myself I just wanted to check if she'd found the problem with the power. The backroom doors were propped open, which was against policy. As I entered, I noticed the emergency lights were different here, dimmer, with a pulsing quality that made the shadows dance. The motion sensors weren't working, so each section remained dark until I entered it. The darkness ahead seemed absolute, swallowing my flashlight beam. I followed what I thought were footsteps, going deeper into the storage area than I'd ever been before. The regular shelving units gave way to older ones, metal racks that looked like they'd been there since the store opened. The concrete floor was stained with dark patches that my mind refused to process. That's when I noticed the walls were wrong. Behind the shelving units, the normal white walls gave way to older ones, institutional green tile that I recognized from photos of the old asylum. It was impossible. The building had been demolished before Target was built. But there it was. In some places, the tile was cracked, revealing older brick behind it. And in those cracks, something was moving. I heard Lisa's voice then, calling from deeper in the darkness. But it wasn't just her voice. It was like multiple voices layered together, slightly out of sync. I knew I should run, but something compelled me forward. The shelving units seemed to move on their own, shifting to create a path that led to a section of the back room I'd never seen before. There was a door there, an old, heavy metal door with a small, wire-reinforced window, the kind you'd find in an asylum. It should have been impossible, but at that point, I was beyond questioning the impossible. Through the window, I could see movement in the darkness beyond. That's when I heard it, the sound of plastic scraping against concrete. I turned to find the mannequin with the chipped cheek standing at the end of the aisle. Not posed, not positioned, but standing naturally, its head tilted at an impossible angle. And it wasn't alone. Other mannequins were there too, their blank faces somehow expressing hunger. The door behind me creaked open on its own. In the darkness beyond, I saw Lisa, or what was pretending to be Lisa. She stood unnaturally still, her body bent at angles that no human spine could achieve. When she turned toward me, her face was smooth plastic like a mannequin's, but with features that kept shifting, trying to form into something recognizable. I ran, or I tried to. The shelving units had moved again, creating a maze. I could hear them scraping across the concrete, changing position every time I turned a corner. The mannequins were everywhere now, their plastic bodies making horrible scraping sounds as they moved. Not walking, but gliding, their joints bending in ways that made my mind recoil. Behind me, the thing that wasn't Lisa called out in that multi-layered voice. "We've been waiting for you. Since before. Since the hospital. We need new faces. New bodies. Yours will do nicely." I don't remember everything that happened next. I remember running down aisles that shouldn't exist, past rows of mannequins that turned to watch me pass. I remember seeing faces in the cracks of those old asylum walls, faces that looked like mannequins but blinked and moved and screamed silently. I remember the sound of plastic footsteps getting closer, no matter how fast I ran. At some point, I found myself in a circular room that I knew couldn't exist within the store's layout. The walls were lined with mirrors, and in each one, I saw myself, but wrong. In each reflection, I looked more and more like them, my skin taking on a plastic sheen, my joints becoming too flexible, my face trying to smooth itself out. The mannequin with the chipped cheek was there in the center of the room, but it wasn't a mannequin anymore. It was Jessica, or what Jessica had become. Her skin had the same plastic sheen I'd seen in the mirrors, her joints bent like a doll's, and her face had that same chip in the cheek, but now I could see it wasn't a chip at all. It was where the change had started, where the plastic had first begun to replace flesh. She reached for me with fingers that were too long, too jointed. "Stay," she said, but her voice was wrong. It was multiple voices, including her original one, all speaking together. "Stay and be part of us. Part of what we've been building since the asylum. We need more. Always more." I saw others behind her, Dave, Lisa, all the employees who had quit over the years. All of them changed, transformed into something between mannequin and human. They moved together, reaching for me with plastic hands that clicked and clattered. What saved me wasn't bravery or quick thinking, it was blind panic. I threw a shelf of merchandise at them and ran. I don't remember finding my way out. I remember fragments. The sound of plastic footsteps behind me, the scraping of mannequin joints, the horrible multi-voiced calling of my name. I remember bursting through the fire exit, setting off alarms that sounded muffled and distant. I remember running to my car and driving until I ran out of gas. I called in my resignation the next day. The store manager didn't sound surprised. When I went to pick up my final paycheck 2 weeks later, I made sure to go during the day. The store looked normal, but I saw the mannequin with the chipped cheek watching me from women's clothing. Its pose was different. It was waving goodbye. I moved away shortly after that, trying to put as much distance between myself and that store as possible. 6 months later, I heard through former coworkers that the location had been quietly closed and demolished. The official reason was structural issues, but I know better. They found things in those walls during demolition, things that were never reported in any official document. But here's the thing that keeps me awake at night. They built a new Target just 2 miles down the road. A bigger, more modern store with even more mannequins. And last week I got an email from someone who works there. They asked if I'd ever seen a mannequin with a small chip in its left cheek, because they swear it keeps appearing in different apartments, always watching, always waiting. Sometimes I dream about that final night, about what I saw in that circular room of mirrors. In these dreams, I look down at my hands and watch as they slowly become smooth and plastic, feel my joints loosening and rearranging. I wake up checking my skin, making sure it's still flesh, still human. But every time I pass a store window or catch my reflection, I find myself looking for that telltale chip, that first sign of the change. They never found Lisa or the temp worker Chris, or any of the others who disappeared over the years. The store's employee records were mysteriously corrupted, and the old asylum documents vanished from county archives. Sometimes I think about Jessica, about how she looked that final night, caught between human and mannequin. I wonder if she's still there in that new store, wearing a different face, but still bearing that chip in her cheek. To anyone reading this who works retail, if you ever see a mannequin with a chip in its left cheek, run. Don't look back. Don't try to document it. Just run. And if your store has a back room with shadows that move on their own and walls that feel wrong, quit. Quit before they choose you to be one of them. Quit before you find yourself in a room full of mirrors, watching your reflection change into something else. Because they're still out there, still spreading. The asylum may be gone, but whatever lived in those walls has found a new home. And it's always looking for new faces to wear. I don't go shopping after dark anymore. I can't look at mannequins without feeling sick. And I've gotten rid of all the mirrors in my house, because sometimes late at night, I swear I can see my reflection starting to change, my skin taking on that familiar plastic sheen. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I can feel a small chip beginning to form on my left cheek. This story comes from my 3 months working security at IKEA, and I've never shared it publicly before. Some people won't believe it. Hell, I barely believe it myself most days. But every word is true, and I think people need to know what really happens in those massive blue and yellow buildings after the customers leave. I took the overnight security position at the Fairview Township IKEA in rural Pennsylvania back in winter 2022. It was a relatively new location, built in an oddly isolated spot about 20 minutes from the nearest town. The store itself was massive, over 350,000 square feet of retail space, plus a warehouse section that seemed to go on forever. From the highway at night, it looked like a giant glowing box in the middle of nowhere, its distinctive blue and yellow exterior visible for miles. The job seemed perfect at first. The pay was well above average for security work, and the overnight shift meant I could finish my online classes during quiet periods. During my interview, the store manager mentioned they had trouble keeping overnight staff, which should have been my first warning sign. But when you're a broke college student with bills to pay, you tend to ignore red flags. My team consisted of just 3 people. Me, the night manager Maria Nielsen, a stern Swedish woman who'd been with the company for 20 years, and the maintenance worker Carl Weber. The store had originally had more overnight staff, but budget cuts and what Maria cryptically called retention issues had whittled us down to the bare minimum. Training was straightforward enough. Every 2 hours, I had to walk a specific path through the store, checking for any security issues. The path was marked by small arrows on the floor, different from the ones customers followed during the day. Stay on the path, Maria insisted during my first night. The store, it can be confusing after dark. That was an understatement. IKEA stores are deliberately designed like mazes, but at night, with most of the lights dimmed, the layout became absolutely labyrinthine. The showroom floor was divided into dozens of model rooms, little apartments, and homes built to showcase the furniture. During the day, there were cheerful, fake living spaces. At night, they became shadowy tableaus that felt like walking through someone else's frozen memories. The marketplace area was even worse. Rows upon rows of shelves filled with thousands of smaller items, creating narrow aisles that seemed to shift and change. The arrows on the floor were supposed to guide me, but sometimes they didn't lead where they should. I'd follow a path I'd walked a dozen times before, only to end up in a completely different section of the store. The first truly strange incident happened during my second week. I was doing my 2 a.m. walkthrough when I heard what sounded like someone assembling furniture, that distinctive sound of Allen wrenches and wooden dowels clicking into place. It was coming from the bedroom section, where we had about 20 model rooms set up. I radioed Carl, thinking he might be doing some late-night maintenance, but he was all the way in the restaurant area, fixing a freezer. When I reached the bedroom section, the sound stopped. But one of the display rooms, a modern minimal bedroom setup that had been perfectly arranged when I passed it 2 hours earlier, was completely disassembled. The bed frame was in pieces, the wardrobes were partially deconstructed, and all the parts were laid out on the floor as if someone had just started the assembly process. The weird part, all the pieces were arranged in a perfect spiral pattern, with the Allen wrench standing straight up in the center, like a tiny monument. I reported it to Maria, who didn't seem surprised. She muttered something in Swedish and told me to rope off the area. When I came back for my next shift, everything was back to normal and nobody mentioned it again. But after that, I started noticing other changes during my rounds. Display rooms would be subtly different each time I passed them. A chair turned around, a lamp moved to the other side of a room, picture frames rearranged on walls. Small things, easy to dismiss if you weren't paying attention. But I was paying attention, and I started taking photos on my phone to prove I wasn't imagining things. Then there were the footsteps. In a store that big, sound echoes in strange ways, but these were different. They always seemed to be just around the corner, always sounded like someone walking purposefully somewhere. But whenever I investigated, I'd find empty aisles and undisturbed showrooms. Carl told me about the shortcuts, unofficial paths through the store that the staff used to get around more quickly. They weren't on any official map, and some of them seemed to defy the building's layout entirely. Don't use them at night, he warned me. Sometimes they don't lead where they're supposed to. I later learned that we'd lost 2 employees who tried using the shortcuts after dark. They were officially listed as having quit, but their cars sat in the employee parking lot for weeks before being towed. The security cameras made everything worse. Part of my job was monitoring the feeds, and I started noticing things that shouldn't be possible. People walking through the marketplace area after hours, disappearing between one camera and the next. Sometimes they looked like customers, sometimes like staff, but they were always just slightly wrong, moving too smoothly or at impossible angles. One night, reviewing footage from the previous shift, I saw someone walk straight through a solid wall in the marketplace. When I slowed down the footage, frame by frame, I could see their face, or rather, the lack of one. Where features should have been, there was just a smooth blank surface, like an unfinished mannequin. I tried to show Maria the footage, but when we reviewed the tape together, that section was just static. She wasn't surprised by that either. The cameras, she said, they don't like to remember what they see at night. That was the first hint that she knew more than she was telling us. The more I looked into the store's history, the stranger things got. I found old newspaper articles about the construction. Apparently, there had been protests when IKEA announced the location. The land had previously belonged to a shipping company that went bankrupt in the 1940s. They'd used the site as a storage facility for cargo from Europe, primarily Sweden. The articles didn't say what happened to all that cargo when the company folded, but it was the employee records that really got to me. I shouldn't have had access to them, but one night I found Maria's office unlocked. The turnover rate for overnight staff was impossible. Dozens of employees over just a few years, most lasting less than a month. The official reasons for leaving were always vague. Personal reasons, better opportunity, family emergency. But there were notes in the margins, written in what looked like Maria's handwriting. Saw something in marketplace, used wrong shortcut, found the other rooms. I didn't understand what those notes meant until the night I discovered the first impossible room. I was doing my rounds, following the arrows like always, when I noticed a new path I'd never seen before. It led to a display room that shouldn't have existed. It was in a space I knew was normally just a wall. The room was set up like a normal IKEA display, but everything was slightly wrong. The furniture was from lines we'd never carried, with names in a language that looked like Swedish but wasn't quite right. And the room, it felt lived in. There were half-empty coffee cups on the tables, warm to the touch. The bed was unmade, the sheets still wrinkled, as if someone had just gotten up. When I ran out of that room and looked back, it was gone. Just a solid wall where the entrance had been. But later that night, reviewing the security footage, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the feed from a camera that should have shown that wall, I saw myself entering the room, but I wasn't alone. Something was following me, something that moved like a person but was assembled all wrong, like furniture put together using the wrong instructions. That's when Carl told me about the others, the security guards and staff members who'd disappeared over the years. They're still here, he said, his voice shaking. Sometimes, late at night, you can hear them trying to find their way back. But the store, it doesn't want to let them go. I should have quit right then. But I needed the job, and part of me didn't want to leave until I understood what was really happening in that store. Looking back, that curiosity almost cost me everything. Because what happened in the warehouse section, what we found in those endless rows of shelves, that was just the beginning of the true horror. But I'll save that part of the story for another time. Just remember, if you're ever in an IKEA after dark and you see a path you've never noticed before, don't follow it. Some shortcuts lead to places you can't come back from. And if you hear the sound of furniture being assembled when the store should be empty, run. Run and don't look back. Because sometimes the things we build are building something of their own. It's taken me some time to continue this story. What happened in the IKEA warehouse still haunts my dreams, and writing about it means reliving those memories. But after sharing the first part, I've received messages from other IKEA employees who've experienced similar things. One message particularly disturbed me, a night worker from a store in Sweden who sent me a photo of what looked like furniture assembling itself. The image was blurry, but I recognized the pattern. It was the same spiral configuration I'd seen in our store. The warehouse section of an IKEA is different from the showroom floor. While the showroom is designed to be maze-like but inviting, the warehouse is purely functional. Massive metal shelving units, stretching up nearly 40 feet high, creating narrow canyons of cardboard boxes and wooden pallets. Our warehouse was particularly large, taking up almost as much space as the showroom itself. The fluorescent lights hung far above, creating pools of harsh light between long shadows. After the strange incidents in the showroom, I started paying more attention to the warehouse during my rounds. The first thing I noticed was the temperature. It was always colder back there, even though the heating system was supposed to be uniform throughout the store. Carl said the thermal sensors showed normal readings, but you could see your breath most nights. Then the furniture arrangements started appearing. The first one I found was in a dead-end aisle between two towering shelf units. Someone or something had taken various pieces from different boxes and assembled them into a perfect replica of my childhood bedroom. Not a display room, but my actual bedroom from when I was 12, down to the exact arrangement of the furniture and the peculiar way I used to angle my desk to see out the window. It was impossible. I'd never told anyone at work about my childhood home, and some of the pieces were from lines IKEA hadn't carried in years. When I showed Maria, she quickly dismantled everything and had the pieces returned to their boxes. But her hands were shaking as she worked, and I heard her muttering in Swedish. Later that night, I found a crumpled note in one of the empty boxes. The writing was in Swedish, but thanks to Google Translate, I could make out most of it. They're learning faster now. The patterns are becoming more personal. Must contact Stockholm office about containment procedures. I started finding more notes after that, scattered throughout the warehouse like breadcrumbs. Some were in Swedish, others in what looked like Old Norse. Many mentioned something called constructoren, the constructor. The translations were unclear, but they all seemed to be warnings about letting it build what it wants. The warehouse itself seemed to be changing. The layout shifted subtly between my rounds, aisles appearing where there should have been solid walls of shelving, paths leading to sections that shouldn't have existed. The inventory computer showed we had exactly 147 aisles, but I counted 153 one night, then 142 the next. When I mentioned this to Carl, he looked frightened and told me to stop counting. It was around this time that Carl disappeared. He'd gone to fix some lights in the self-service furniture area, a section of shorter shelves where customers could pick up boxed items themselves. We heard his scream over the radio, followed by the sound of wood scraping against concrete and what might have been words in Swedish. By the time I reached his location, all I found was his tool belt and a half-assembled Billy bookcase that hadn't been there before. The security cameras showed something, but the footage made no sense. Carl was there one moment. Then the shelves around him seemed to move on their own, the boxes rearranging themselves into impossible configurations. The last frame, before the video cut, to static showed what looked like hands reaching out from between the boxes, hands made of roughly assembled wooden slats and metal fixings. That's when Maria finally told me the truth. She'd been with IKEA since the store was built, but her connection went back further. Her grandfather had been part of the crew of the Swedish cargo ship that disappeared in the 1940s, the SS Vactran. The ship had been carrying more than just furniture. Among its cargo were artifacts from an old Swedish church, including pieces of an altar said to be able to build doorways. The ship vanished somewhere in the Atlantic, but pieces of its cargo started showing up along the east coast. The shipping company bought the land where our store now stood to store the salvaged materials. When they went bankrupt, IKEA purchased the property and everything on it. They used the salvaged wood and metal in the store's construction, not knowing what they were really building. The constructor, Maria explained, it was trapped in those materials. In the old days, Swedish craftsmen knew how to build things that could change, create spaces that shouldn't exist. But this one, it got loose during the salvage, and now it's building again. She showed me shipping manifests from the Vactran that had been stored in a hidden safe in her office. The manifests listed normal furniture shipments, but in the margins were notes about living woods and self-assembling structures. The final entry, dated the day before the ship vanished, mentioned something taking shape in the cargo hold. The corporate office knew about the problems, but kept it quiet. Every IKEA store had its quirks, Maria said, but ours was different. The constructor was stronger here, more active. It had been building something in the warehouse, piece by piece, using the furniture and the spaces between reality that only it could access. Time started behaving strangely after that conversation. My shift seemed to stretch and contract randomly. Sometimes I'd check my watch and find that hours had passed in what felt like minutes. Other times, I'd spend what felt like hours walking down a single aisle, only to discover that barely a minute had ticked by. The shortcuts staff used between sections became even more unreliable. I once tried to use one to get from the warehouse to the showroom and ended up in what looked like the cargo hold of an old ship. The walls made of rough wood and metal fittings that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I ran back the way I came and found myself in the marketplace, but everything was subtly wrong. The products on the shelves were twisted versions of our normal stock, assembled in ways that hurt to look at. Then we started finding the furniture arrangements that mimicked people's homes, not just mine, but seemingly everyone who worked in the store. Perfect replicas would appear overnight, built from mismatched pieces that somehow fit together in impossible ways. The frightening part wasn't just their accuracy, but how they changed. Each time we found a new arrangement, it showed the rooms as they currently were. Moving furniture around in your home would be reflected in the next arrangement that appeared. One night, I found an arrangement that showed my apartment's living room exactly as I'd left it that morning, including the coffee mug I'd forgotten to put in the sink and the throw blanket I'd knocked onto the floor rushing to work. But in this version, all the furniture was built wrong, assembled in ways that suggested movement, like everything was caught in mid-transformation. Maria said the constructor was learning, studying us through the furniture we surrounded ourselves with. It wants to understand how we live, she said, so it can build better spaces to keep us in. That was when she told me about the missing employees, how they hadn't quit or disappeared, but had been collected by the constructor. It needs inhabitants for what it's building, she explained. Carl won't be the last. I started researching the history of the Vactran and its cargo. The old church the artifacts came from had been demolished in the 1930s after a series of disappearances. Local legends spoke of a carpenter who had made a deal with something ancient, learning to build doorways to places that shouldn't exist. The altarpieces on the ship were supposedly his last work. The more I discovered, the more I noticed changes in the store. The warehouse started feeling larger, the spaces between shelves deeper than physically possible. I'd turn down an aisle and find it stretching into darkness, the end invisible despite the overhead lights. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of movement in that darkness, things that looked like furniture, but moved like living creatures, assembling and disassembling themselves as they retreated from my flashlight beam. The worst part was the sound, the constant, subtle noise of things being built. Allen wrenches turning, dowels sliding into place, pieces clicking together. It came from everywhere and nowhere, like the whole warehouse was slowly assembling itself into something new. Sometimes, late at night, I'd hear other sounds mixed in, voices calling out in Swedish, the creaking of ship timbers, and what might have been screams. One night, I found Carl's radio in a newly appeared aisle. It was partially embedded in what looked like a half-assembled wardrobe, the plastic and metal of the radio fusing with the wood and screws of the furniture. When I picked it up, it crackled to life, and I heard Carl's voice. But he was speaking Swedish, his words distorted, as if they were being filtered through layers of wood and metal. Maria translated what she could, but most of it was gibberish. The parts she could understand were worse. It's building something big, a place inside other places. It wants to make a perfect room, but it needs to understand, needs to watch us, learn how we live. Please don't let it in your home. It starts with the furniture. That's when I noticed my apartment's furniture had started to change. Subtle differences at first. Drawers that didn't close quite right, chairs that felt wrong to sit in, tables that seemed to shift position when I wasn't looking. I started sleeping on the floor, afraid to use my bed. But even that didn't feel safe. The floorboards began to feel like they were trying to arrange themselves around me as I slept. But what happened during the snowstorm, when the power went out and we got trapped in the store, that's the part I'm still trying to make sense of. The part about what the constructor was really building, and what we found in the center of its maze. The part about how Maria had known all along, and why some of the missing employees had gone willingly. I'll share that final part soon, but for now, I'll just say this. If you shop at IKEA and buy their furniture, check the assembly instructions carefully. If they seem wrong, if the diagrams show configurations that don't quite make sense, burn the furniture immediately. And if you ever hear something moving in your home late at night, something that sounds like furniture slowly assembling itself, don't look for the source. Run. Run before it finishes building whatever it's making out of your home and everyone in it. Because the constructor is still out there, still learning, still building. And every piece of furniture it sends out into the world is another potential doorway to the spaces it creates. Spaces that look like homes but are really cages, built to hold something that was never meant to be human. I've put off writing this final part of my story for weeks, partly because I'm still not sure anyone will believe it, but mostly because writing it means admitting to myself that it really happened. My therapist says confronting the trauma might help. But how do you confront something that defies reality itself? Even now, months later, I check every piece of furniture in my house daily, looking for signs that they're trying to change. It happened during one of the worst snowstorms Pennsylvania had seen in decades. The forecast had predicted heavy snow, but nobody expected the blizzard that actually hit. I arrived for my shift at 10 p.m., just as the storm was intensifying. The parking lot was already buried under several inches of snow, and the store's massive blue and yellow exterior was barely visible through the whiteout conditions. Maria was acting strange that night. She'd posted new notes throughout the store, warnings in Swedish that she wouldn't translate for me. She also insisted on checking every shortcut in the building, marking some with red tape and others with black. The black ones, she said, don't use them tonight. No matter what you hear. She wouldn't explain why. By midnight, the storm had knocked out power to most of the surrounding area. The store's emergency generators kicked in, but they only powered essential systems and some lighting. The regular fluorescents were replaced by dim emergency lights that cast everything in an eerie bluish glow. The showroom floor became a maze of shadows, and the warehouse was almost completely dark, except for scattered pools of emergency lighting that seemed to float in the blackness. That's when we started seeing the other lights, ones that weren't part of the emergency system. They moved through the darkness like will-o-wisps, casting a sickly yellow glow that reminded me of old IKEA logos. They seemed to be searching for something, moving purposefully through the aisles, occasionally clustering around certain pieces of furniture before moving on. I was doing my rounds when I first heard it. The sound of assembly, but magnified 1,000-fold. It was coming from everywhere at once. The clicking of parts fitting together, the scraping of furniture being moved, the unmistakable sound of Allen wrenches turning by themselves. But underneath it all was something else, something that sounded almost like singing, a deep rhythmic chanting in what might have been Old Swedish. The security cameras were still working on emergency power, and what they showed was impossible. Throughout the store, furniture was moving on its own, pieces disconnecting and reassembling themselves into new configurations. Display rooms were restructuring, walls were shifting, and the narrow aisles of the marketplace were rearranging into patterns that seemed to form symbols when viewed from above. But it was in the warehouse where the real horror was taking place. The massive shelving units were coming apart, their metal frames twisting and reconnecting like some giant erector set coming to life. The box furniture was unpacking itself, pieces floating in the air before snapping together in configurations that ignored both physics and IKEA's own assembly instructions. I tried to radio Maria, but all I got was static and what sounded like that same chanting closer now. When I tried to use my phone to call for help, the screen showed only an endless scrolling of Swedish text, assembly diagrams that shifted and changed as I watched. That's when I saw someone walking through the marketplace, a figure that looked like Carl, but moving all wrong. I followed, calling out to him, but when he turned, his body had been partially transformed into furniture. His arms were now constructed of wooden slats and metal fittings, his torso a half-assembled bookcase, his legs a pair of table supports that somehow still allowed him to walk. His face was worst of all. His features were slowly being replaced by smooth, unfinished wood grain. "It's time," he said, his voice a mixture of human speech and the sound of wood creaking. "The constructor is ready. The final assembly can begin." I ran through the marketplace, past display rooms that were knitting themselves together into impossible new spaces, through shortcuts that seemed to lead backwards in time. I caught glimpses of the store being built, of the cargo ship being loaded, of the old church being torn down. The constructor's lights followed me, and with them came the sounds of assembly growing ever louder. I found myself in a part of the warehouse I'd never seen before, where the shelves had pulled back to reveal a massive open space. In the center was... I still struggle to describe it. Imagine every piece of furniture in the store, every component and fitting, assembling itself into a structure that shouldn't be possible. It was like a building made of buildings, a space that contained other spaces, all of them constantly shifting and rebuilding themselves. And there was Maria, standing at the edge of this impossible construction. But she wasn't alone. Around her were others, people I recognized from the missing employee files. All of them were in various stages of transformation, their bodies merging with the furniture they had once sold. They were singing that chant I'd heard, their voices mixing with the sounds of assembly. "You need to understand," Maria said when she saw me. Her arm had become a series of interlocked table legs, her hair turning to fine wooden fibers. "This is what my grandfather discovered on the Vactron. The constructor isn't just building furniture. It's building a new reality, a perfect space where everything is ordered, everything fits together. We're helping it understand how to build spaces for humans by becoming part of those spaces ourselves." As she spoke, the structure behind her continued to grow, pieces of furniture flowing together like liquid wood and metal. I could see rooms forming within it, perfect rooms, ideal spaces that seemed to draw from everyone's memories of home. But they were wrong, fundamentally wrong in ways that hurt to look at. And in those rooms, I could see movement, the other missing employees, now fully transformed into hybrid creatures of flesh and furniture, living in these impossible spaces. "The constructor came here long ago," Maria continued, her voice taking on that multi-layered quality I'd heard before. It taught the old carpenters how to build things that could change, could grow. The altarpieces were its first attempt to build a doorway between its reality and ours. But now, with IKEA, it has everything it needs. Every home that buys our furniture becomes part of its network, potential spaces it can use to expand. The structure pulsed with light, and I saw what she meant. Through its many windows and doors, I could glimpse other IKEA stores, other warehouses, and thousands of normal homes, all connected by the furniture within them, all slowly being converted into spaces the constructor could use. "Join us," Maria said, reaching for me with her furniture limb. "Help us build something perfect." I saw Carl emerge from the structure, now almost completely transformed. His movements were fluid despite his wooden components, and his face, what remained of it, held an expression of ecstasy. "It doesn't hurt," he said. "It feels like coming home, like finally fitting together properly." The constructor's lights swirled around me, and I felt the pull of the structure. For a moment, I understood what they meant. I could feel the perfection of it, the appeal of becoming part of something so precisely engineered, so perfectly assembled. My body started to tingle, and I looked down to see my fingers beginning to transform, becoming smooth and wooden. What saved me wasn't bravery or quick thinking, it was clumsiness. I stumbled backward and fell against a fire alarm. The sprinklers activated, and the water seemed to interfere with whatever power was working through the store. The structure shuddered, its constant self-assembly temporarily disrupted. The transformed employees screamed in a mixture of human voices and creaking wood. I ran again, but this time the shortcuts were working in my favor. Each turn brought me closer to the exit, even as I heard the sounds of pursuit behind me, the scraping of wooden limbs on concrete, the clicking of metal joints, and that endless chanting growing fainter. I burst out of the emergency exit into the snowstorm, setting off alarms that were swallowed by the howling wind. I ran to my car and drove until I hit a snowbank, then kept going on foot until I found a gas station that still had power. When the storm cleared 2 days later, the store was gone. The official story was that the roof had collapsed under the weight of the snow, and the building was quickly demolished. But I know what really happened. The constructor had finally finished its work, taking the transformed employees and the impossible structure with it to whatever reality it came from. They built a new IKEA a few towns over, using some of the salvaged materials from our store. Last week, I saw a news article about strange occurrences there. Missing employees, furniture found rearranged in the morning, sounds of assembly coming from empty rooms. I live in a studio apartment now with minimal furniture, none of it from IKEA. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear the sound of Allen wrenches turning in the walls. And when I look in a mirror, I check my hands carefully, watching for any sign that they're becoming too smooth, too wooden, because the constructor is still out there, still building. Every IKEA store is a potential doorway, every piece of furniture a possible seed for its next attempt. And somewhere, in spaces that shouldn't exist, Maria and Carl and all the others are still being assembled and reassembled, becoming part of something that was never meant to exist in our reality. I won't shop at IKEA anymore, obviously. But I worry about all those people who do, who fill their homes with furniture that might be more than it appears. So let me give you one final warning. If you have IKEA furniture in your home, pay attention to it. If you notice pieces trying to assemble themselves differently, or rooms that seem larger at night than during the day, get rid of it immediately. And if you ever hear that sound, that distinctive click of parts fitting together when no one's around, leave. Leave before your home becomes part of the constructor's perfect space, before you become part of its endless assembly. As for me, I'm moving again soon. I've noticed the walls of my apartment starting to feel different, more like finished wood than plaster. And yesterday, I found an Allen wrench on my pillow, one I never bought. its metal surface inscribed with Swedish words that seemed to move when I tried to read them. Some say the old IKEA site is still there, hidden somehow, the impossible structure still growing behind veils of reality. Security guards at the new store sometimes report seeing lights moving through their warehouse at night, and missing person reports in the area have increased. But no one investigates too deeply. After all, it's just a furniture store. Just remember, not everything that looks like furniture is meant to be furniture. And not every space that looks like home is meant for human habitation. The constructor is patient, and its assembly instructions were never meant for us to understand.